Hello and welcome to Reimagining Love. I'm Dr. Alexandra Solomon. I have been studying relationships for over 20 years as a couples therapist, a professor, an award-winning author, and as a wife, mother, daughter, sister, and friend. Now, I'm inviting you into this space each week as I dig into some of the toughest and most fascinating relational dilemmas of our time. If you want to discover how to create vibrant and loving relationships in your own life, you have come to the right place. This is Reimagining Love. Hi there, welcome back. I am joined by a really special guest today, and I'm so excited for you to hear from her. Shannon Watts is the founder of Moms Demand Action, the nation's largest grassroots group fighting gun violence in the U.S. Like many of us, Shannon was left outraged and broken after hearing news stories about school shootings and seeing the impact of gun violence on communities across the country. One night, her sadness transformed to rage and her life was changed after a Facebook post kicked off what would become Moms Demand Action, a movement of Americans fighting for public safety measures that can protect people from gun violence. They work to pass stronger gun laws, and they work to close the loopholes that jeopardize the safety of families and communities. They know that gun violence is preventable, and they are committed to doing what it takes to keep families safe. Shannon has been named one of Time's 100 most influential people, a Forbes 50 over 50 changemaker, and a Glamour Woman of the Year. She's also someone who went through an extraordinary transformation herself, and this is the focus of our conversation today, as well as the focus of her new book, Fired Up: How to Turn Your Spark into a Flame and Come Alive at Any Age. Shannon empowers women to break free from limits, trust their instincts, and lead with passion to create meaningful change. I loved hearing about her own experience, as well as the ways that her relationships, particularly her marriage, needed to evolve as she went through this incredible unfolding. There's so much goodness in this conversation, and I can't wait for you to join me. Let's dive in. Shannon, I'm really excited that you're here with me today. Thank you for taking the time.
Oh, I'm thrilled to be here.
I've been a fangirl of yours from afar for so long and just have always been impressed by your ferocity, by the way that you seamlessly weave together your feminism and your activism. And I was telling a member of my team that we were having you on the show today, and she said, "Oh my God, Shannon is a badass, and please tell her thank you from me." So you've got a big fan group in my organization alone. So thank you.
That's so kind. Thank you.
Yeah. So before we dive into all of the things I want to talk to you about, I want to ask you the question that we ask all of our guests at the top of the show. Are you ready for it? Okay. Shannon, how are you reimagining love in one of your important relationships these days?
So it's such an important question because it does change so much over a lifetime. I'm 54 now, and I'm just realizing how much how we love changes over our lifetime. You know, my kids are all adults now. And in a lot of ways, I'm realizing that love isn't about controlling or fixing things. It's about being able to step back and really offer support when it's needed, but also letting them find their own way. And that can be difficult, right? I have a kid who's trans, and I worry about their safety. And it's the first trans person, that I've had in my family. And it's such an important lesson to me about unconditional love and also separating your ego from your kids, right? And their journey is their journey. It's not mine. My job is to support them on that journey. And so that's, I think, teaching me a lot about love right now. And then, my marriage, this is my second marriage. We've been together now almost 18 years. And the way our love has changed over the last 2 decades, to me is so beautiful because it's the most positive, most supportive relationship I've ever had in my life. And it has taught me about how I can accept unconditional love. So And I'm feeling like I'm in a little bit of a love bubble right now.
You are. You are. Do you find that the support and conversations that you're able to have with your husband about what it means to love adult kids from the sidelines, like, is there flow between those two realms? Like, as you learn how to parent adult kids, like, are the conversations with
Mm.
him supportive and informing and grounding around that other facet?
It's such an interesting question because, my husband was born in 1959 and I was born in 1971. And there is a very big difference between those two generations. And, I was talking about my kid who's trans. Like, it's not just teaching me, who was brought up in a generation to be much more accepting of love and a journey, but also him in a very different way, right? Because his gender constructs are so, steeped in this history and this culture of being sort of like a cis white male. And so watching him be able to be open and to be loving and to be supportive and to change, watching him use not just she and him, but also they, it's been beautiful to watch his own journey with this. But I would also say my husband is just a more patient person than I am and very thoughtful and wise. And when I might be very reactive and get concerned about something that my kids are doing, any five of them, he is that sacred pause that helps me get perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. What an asset, right? What an asset to have that, to have a built-in teacher who's reminding you, like, okay, before we speak, let's just slow it down for a moment. And yeah, that's wonderful. Like that's like complementarity in its finest. You already have mentioned the sacred pause. And so I want to, even though we introduced you at the top of the show, I want you to take a little time to talk about who you are and the work that you're up to, but also speaking to the sacred pauses that it seems like have really informed the different chapters of your activism and your journey. So I would love to hear, I would love for the Reimagining Love folks to just hear you in your own words talk about your journey.
I have just come to understand, again, with time and maturity, what this sacred pause is. But when I look back, I see that every time I have paused, that it has helped to prepare me for whatever is next. And the first real pause I can remember is between my career in corporate communications, which I did right out of college until my early 40s. And then I remarried, and my husband and I were blending our 5 children, and I thought, this is the right time with kids all the way from elementary to high school to step back, focus on my new marriage, blending my family, and I really did think at that point that I would go back into the workforce, but just this idea of pausing and slowing down and focusing on what really mattered at that moment. And so I did that. I left my job. I was at home for 5 years, which was a huge adjustment, right, to me, someone who's very type A and, always just looking for something to do. And at the end of that 5 years, I can remember I was in my home we lived at the time in outside of Indianapolis. It was a very cold winter day, and, I had just had these huge piles of laundry on the bed for all the kids and was folding them, and there was breaking news on my television that there was an active shooter inside an elementary school in Connecticut. And like so many people, probably you too, I just sort of sat where I was and did nothing for hours as I watched this tragedy unfold. And I was devastated. I couldn't believe that someone could take a weapon of war into a school and slaughter 20 children and 6 educators in minutes. And even more frightening to me was the idea that we as a nation would do nothing. I went to bed in tears, my eyes swollen from crying, and I woke up full of rage. Like at some point during the night, that sadness turned into abject outrage. And so I went online and I posted that we needed women to organize around and against the gun lobby, just as they had drunk driving when I was a teenager in the 1980s. I had 75 Facebook friends. I really didn't know that anything would come of it, and it went viral back in, 2012 when that was social media was just becoming a thing, and it completely upended my life overnight. All these women who lived all over the country, red states, blue states, rural areas, urban areas saying, "I wanna do this where I live." And very quickly, even though I knew nothing about organizing or gun violence or the legislative process, I really wasn't very political. I became the leader of this organization. It was that sacred pause, I think, in retrospect, that helped me back away from what I'd been doing to sit with what I knew and to get ready for whatever was next.
If we could talk to the Shannon pre Sandy Hook, would she have had any whispering or clue that this would be the direction that she would go? It feels really intuitive. And I wonder how much, if you remember any part of it being also really conscious.
I look back and it feels like it was inevitable. If you talk about someone becoming an expert at something, I think it's Malcolm Gladwell says you spend 10,000 hours doing something. I spent at least that writing press releases, creating brands, writing stories and narratives, right, for products. I was a communications expert. And it was every single one of those skills that helped me start Moms Demand Action and to make it seem like an incredibly powerful, incredible organization within, months. And also when I look back, I realized I was not fulfilled in how I was using those skills, right? To sell everything from, craisins to corn ethanol. Like that was not my calling. That was not what made me come alive. And yet it was a training ground to help me prepare for Moms Demand Action. So I'm grateful for all of it, but I didn't feel alive. I didn't feel fulfilled until I was 41 years old.
Which there's a whole entire lesson in that, right? About not putting a timestamp or an age limit on when we get to come alive or when that happens for us. Yeah, because I think what I'm so struck by is absolutely you had everything in you, skills wise, I'm sure temperament and personality wise, which I want to hear more about. And all of that was there. But I love this idea that you were in a pause. You were in a plane of possibility. And so it's like your skills met up with this moment and you made an action that then led to the thousands and thousands and thousands of other actions. I think there's something like so beautiful in the blend of skill and training and then just like intuitive movement.
Yeah, I had actually been, manifesting has so many connotations now, right? It's very woo woo, but I really had been manifesting for myself what would come next. I was reading books about how do I figure out who I am and what I want to do and just being open and making that an affirmation, even when I meditated, like to help me understand what I should be doing as I was getting ready to, send out my resume and go back into the corporate world. And so I was very much ready, but that doesn't mean that when that moment happened, I wasn't absolutely overwhelmed. I can remember crying in the closet. I would go and I would lay down in the closet and I would cry because I felt so much pressure and I felt like I didn't have a choice that I had been given this responsibility or I had taken it on and it was going to have major implications for my life. And there was one day when a woman called me and she and I had worked together in communications. I didn't know her very well. She had a little firm in Washington, D.C., and we had done some work together. And she just happened to call me and to check in on me and to say, like, I see you're doing this out in the world right now. It's so interesting. And I just started sobbing. I'm sure she was not ready for whatever that conversation turned into. But, the most important thing she said to me during that conversation was, you don't have to do this. And just by saying that, it just let all the pressure out. And it helped me have the perspective to say, oh, I want to do this. I don't have to do this. I want to do this. And I went into it with such a different attitude suddenly. And that was a real pivotal moment in those early days.
Ah, it makes so much sense. I'm imagining your insides having to expand to create all of this like capacity for the responsibility, not to mention the raw emotion that is in, it's the area of creating sensible gun policy. It's so emotionally loaded. So the amount of expansion and to contain all of it inside of you must have been so mighty. And so for her to say, you don't have to, was an important reminder.
You talk about emotion, and I think that's an important part of the story too, which is my go-to emotion And I feel like we all have one. It comes up for us anytime something happens. For my husband, it's loneliness. For me, it has always been anger. I can remember just feeling a sense of anger my whole life. Anger at myself, anger at other people, or anger at injustice. And I'm a practicing Buddhist, and we talk a lot about how anger can be poison, but it can also be righteous. I do think what helped me get through those early days was that I was so angry at what had happened inside the school. And I was so angry the more I learned about gun violence and our lax gun laws. And it was that anger that became righteous and really fueled my ability to work on this from the moment I got out of bed till the moment I went to bed 7 days a week for 11 years. I don't think that without that anger as fuel, I could have done it.
How does that poisonous anger feel different from righteous anger? If I'm imagining somebody listening and what is the quality? I think for so many of us women, anger is a highly uncomfortable emotion in general. It's socialized out of us in so many ways. And there are times when anger is the sort of tip of the iceberg under which there are layers of, sadness and shame and loneliness. And there are times, to speak to your point, where the anger is righteous. The anger is absolutely not on my watch. This is not okay. Do you have a felt sense inside of your body of when, have you even had the experiences of that kind of toxic, churny anger that's not productive versus the righteous anger that fuels action, and how they feel differently for you?
Yes. I mean, this could be a whole nother podcast, but I struggled with a very severe ADHD, and then the comorbidities that come along with it, right? Generalized anxiety, OCD, very severe OCD. And it was, the 70s and 80s. And I was just seen as a very problematic, difficult kid. And I think the anger I had at always being punished, at always being treated differently, at always failing came out truly in my teens and resulted in a little bit of ODD, right? Oppositional disorder. I was a very, very difficult teen from when I started failing out of middle school until, probably I graduated from high school. And that anger was sort of turned inward and outward, but definitely at my parents. I'm an only child, and they would tell you the teen years were not great. It was toxic and it was poisonous to me and to my relationships. And it wasn't until I figured out I was really good at something, which was communications, that I started to mature and to feel like I had a skill set that helped me compete with other people or to prove my worthiness. But I would say that I am someone, and I kind of learned, I think, this from my parents, which is, trouble damages. And so if someone comes at me, I will come at you 1,000 times harder. I'm not that way anymore in my personal life, but I certainly used that to my advantage when I took on the NRA.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Oh, what an incredible example of I always talk about how our gifts and our wounds are next door neighbors, right? So all of the tenderness that you had experiencing ADHD, the ways you were misunderstood, underestimated, punished, and the wounds that you have there, then you have figured out how to catalyze them as a gift. It allows you to put yourself in spaces with ferocity instead of fear, with a sense of voice. So that is you are embodying that example of how, had you not, it's not that we would ever wish the pain of your past on you or on anybody. And who knows what your work in the world would look like without that experience.
Yes, I'm very grateful, and I can feel when that anger starts to creep in now, and meditation helps me with that. But I am very self-aware, and I think that is helpful to make sure that when I think about anger, I'm thinking about it in more of this righteous manner, right? And not something that I want to be part of my personal relationships.
Right. Part of your practice is to delineate the way that you have to use anger in your activism and where you don't want anger to be in your personal relationship. So that's one of the
Exactly.
ways that you distinguish. Yeah. As you started to grow, and it took on and grew quickly, for all of us, like in that space of expansion and new realms, there's like that voice inside of our heads, whether it's imposter syndrome or self-doubt or hurdles that come up for us. What are the ones that you remember for you along the way, and how did you navigate them?
Well, as soon as I started Moms Demand Action, I got criticism. And that was, you don't need to start this. This already exists. You're not the right person to do it. It can't be done. Right? I would cold call people for advice. And it was almost always, you shouldn't do this. And I trusted my gut. I knew that people wanted this. I knew, or specifically women, I knew intuitively it was going to be successful and that it was going to be impactful. And I was able to, in those early days, divide out what was constructive and what was something I didn't need to pay attention to or listen to. Because I really did realize that the worst that could happen was that I would fail or that Moms Demand Action would fail. And at least we had tried something. I think where I have this book coming out, which I know we're going to talk about, but I did, over 70 interviews with women for it. And everyone has this gating factor that holds them back. Almost all women have some kind of, societal baggage that goes with everything they do, this voice that tells them they can't succeed. And so they don't try or they go into it timidly. And I think, mine in those early days was maybe thinking I knew more than I did. And maybe just being a little too sharp elbowed and a little too aggressive because I knew that everything was set up against me and us to fail. And what was so important was that I had other women, wise women who were mentors to me. Lucy McBath, who is a gun violence survivor and now a congresswoman in Georgia, was one of the first to say to me, you are a white woman who lives in the suburbs. And this can't just be about school shootings that, at the time, even more impacted mostly white children. That's less and less the case today. But, I had so many mentors and wise women who were giving me advice. And I'm so grateful that I listened to it, that I took that in. I think we call it imposter syndrome. In many ways, we are imposters because we're the first people to ever be in those spaces. And it's not necessarily that we're imposters.
That's
It's more that
right.
we're,
The system.
pioneers.
Yeah, sure. Sure.
And so, there were times when I thought, who am I to do this? Who am I to say this? Who am I to think I'm an expert? But I think because this mostly, patriarchal society thought the same thing, that anger came in. And I thought, you know what? Why not me? And
Mm-hmm.
why someone else, maybe almost always a white man. And so I can see some of the things that we're up against, and because they make me angry, that I can act to push back against them.
Yes. You had to learn how to discern between the who am I to do this voice, what to the degree to which that is something that is arising from within Shannon, and the degree to which that is arising from the outside world, having it would have been very convenient to the NRA had you believed that voice. And so was it really your voice? Was it really ever your voice? And I think that process of like returning to sender, the stuff that isn't yours to begin with, to know that a lot of that questioning comes from, right, your years as a woman, the force of the NRA and their desire to have women and everybody else, be quiet, then also helped you catalyze it then back into that righteous anger rather than personalizing it, letting it sit inside of you.
Exactly. And it is
Mhm.
a process, right? I didn't come to this fully formed. I can look back 11 years, 12 years on and say, oh, this was what that was.
I also hear something that I know is deeply important in my life is the community of women. My really dear friend Kim calls it like the witnessing eyes, like that the scary things are less scary to do when you know that you've got people who are going to be sounding boards or be like a checking in point or give you feedback in ways that feel really inviting and encouraging rather than critical and demeaning. And so I hear that in your story as well, that you've had that all along the way, mentors, but then also I'm sure friends and peers who have been with you as you've wrestled with all this.
Yeah, friendship is also an interesting conversation to delve into because, I'm an only child, I'm an introvert, and here I was suddenly in the middle of this huge group of women that just grew exponentially. And it really was a way to finally find my people, women who felt the same way I did, who had the same values as I did, who were in it for the long run like I was, and who were willing to learn from and to teach one another. And what's so fascinating to watch is how those communities, they become about more than just activism. I have seen women who I thought knew each other their whole lives. I would show up at an event and they just met through Moms Demand Action, but they were suddenly best friends. And, women who helped volunteers who were diagnosed with cancer and were at their, bedside when they were passing away and had just met each other through Moms Demand Action, or who fixed each other's homes after hurricanes or fires. I mean, it's just so fascinating to watch what happens when you bring together women and you create this community that makes them feel empowered and connected for a common cause. It just opens so much up in all of us.
That's so cool. I wanted to for sure make sure that I talked to you about the intersection of intimate relation. We're talking about the friendship that emerges from activism, but I want to also explore with you the ways in which I'm imagining, a mom who's joined Moms Demand Action and now she's developing community there. Whatever we're doing in any domain of our life then travels home with us and impacts, our primary relationship with our intimate partner. And I am thinking about, just therapy clients I've worked with over the years, women I've known over the years, about when they take on, like when they really kind of deepen into their purpose and find something that they're passionate about, it shakes the system, it shakes the system of the marriage. And I wonder what you can say to us about that, destabilizing, not necessarily in a bad way, right? But the destabilizing that happens when one partner is exploring activism, especially activism that is as personal and intimate and emotional as fighting for sensible gun policy. What have you seen and experienced around the impact on intimate relationships?
It was so destabilizing at first. I can remember the night that I started Moms Demand Action on Facebook, and I didn't realize I was starting it, right? I had just posted this clarion call to action. And my husband and I got in bed that night, and he looked at me and he said, "This is going to be a very big deal." And we kind of sat with that. What did that mean? I mean, we were in, what you might call the merge. We were so crazily in love. I mean, we didn't, we would text each other while we were at the grocery store. We hadn't even been married 4 years. Plus, we were blending our family of five kids, and we had that dog. And my husband was used to me being at home and being, the driver for the kids and being the lunch maker and, doing all the things that I was doing as a stay-at-home mom for those 5 years. And suddenly, I was busier than I had ever been in my corporate career. Gun violence was all I thought about. I would wake up in the middle of the night and go work in another room because I just had so many ideas or so many things that needed to be done. And it was, as you said, destabilizing. I mean, we were arguing and there was so much separation. I was suddenly traveling and he was having to do so much more. And what was interesting to watch was that was not all negative, right? That he was doing more, that my ex-husband was doing more, that they were doing it together. I can remember I was out of town and one of my kids won this soccer award. I think they were like a sophomore in high school. And they sent me a picture and, my ex-husband is got their arm through one arm and my husband has their arm through the other and they're walking them across the field, and that moment wouldn't have happened if I had been at home. But the thing that my husband and I decided early on in our marriage was that because it was both of our second marriage, that we were going to go to therapy at least once every 2 weeks, rain or shine. If we were as happy as we'd ever been, or if we were as upset as we would ever been, we were going to go to therapy as sort of like a prophylactic, right? As a way to maintain our marriage and to get through trials and tribulations, which was very helpful when this happened. We talked about this, for weeks and weeks and weeks on end. How are we going to do this? And how are we going to manage this? And what we came to realize was that, marriage is a container and it has to be big enough to hold all the things you want and need to do. And I very much wanted and needed to lead Moms Demand Action. And that was such an incredible and important journey and evolution in our marriage because, 5 years later, he ended up taking a job that was incredibly demanding and required him to travel. And I could, instead of being resentful and saying, you didn't support me or whatever it was, we had that foundation in place where we could say, oh, this is a container and this is part of what you want to do. And Shannon did what she did. And now, John is going to do what he does. And he has been incredibly proud and incredibly supportive. And I can't imagine, where our marriage would be if this hadn't happened because it just really turbocharged our unconditional love for one another.
What I want a listener to hear is the destabilization doesn't mean it's wrong. The destabilization, in fact, means that it's working, right? Like that's what has to happen. And the image you give of the container, that the container isn't a fixed size, that the two of you had to expand this container. And in that process of doing that, you had to resist the urge, however it was for you, to shrink, to apologize, to overcompensate. And then John had to tend to whatever arose in him, his fears of being abandoned, his fears of, am I enough for her? His fears of, whatever it was, like whatever came up for him. And none of that meant that the endeavor was wrong. None of it meant the endeavor was wrong. It meant that the endeavor was an opportunity for the two of you to explore all of this.
Yes, that is exactly right. And, I think also what came up for him was a little bit of like, wow, Shannon found her thing, and how do I do that? How can I find my thing?
Oh, yes. Right. I heard that part too. And that's right. That is such a good point because I think in times when I see this, when the person in John's spot there, when they are resisting, when they are frumphing around and stomping around and, feeling very victim-y and martyry, it so often is that your brightness, like the illumination of your, like being in your passion, ends up being holding up a mirror, right? So that's a really big invitation, right? So sometime, and I'm not saying this, right? So what you're saying is that part of John recognized that part of his, whatever the feelings were, part of his feelings about your work were that what was being highlighted for him was, to what degree am I on my purpose right now? To what
Exactly.
degree? That's cool. That's cool. I mean, it's hard as F, but it's cool.
That's right.
It's really
He picks
hard.
that for him, right? That's his thing.
That's right. And
Yeah.
you couldn't dim your light back down in
Yep.
order. I mean, you could have dimmed your light back down, and then he would have not had to worry about whatever he was starting to worry about. You absolutely could have. And then this wouldn't, the organization wouldn't have been able to become what it became, but the two of you persisted. And then John got this chance that he may never have gotten to have of leaving his role and taking on a new job. And then I heard you also say that then you had then the privilege of accommodating and pivoting to help his dreams come true. That didn't feel like a source of resentment. That was a source of pride. Like, sweet, I know what this is. I know I watched you do it for me. I know how to do it for you.
Exactly. I mean, to be fans for one another instead of being detractors, I think enables you to do so much more in your life. Again, we all have these wounds that we take with us from childhood, but I would say, one of mine is, particularly with having ADHD, is sort of feeling not unconditionally loved. And in a lot of ways, I have, I think, been reparented through the love of my husband to be softer, to be more open, and to be able to be that fan instead of, kind of withholding.
Oh, I relate to that so deeply. Like on a significantly smaller scale, when I one of my wounds from childhood is being afraid of being too much of my stuff, doing harm to other people. And so then when I launched a podcast, I remember my husband of 26 years, listened to the first episode, and he pulled me into the bedroom and sat me down in the bed and like looked me in my eyes and was like, I knew you were starting a podcast. I didn't know how extraordinary you were. It didn't have to be this extraordinary, and it was like, oh wait, I can be big and I can be doing the things that really light me up and you're not scared and it's not too much for you. It was just like, to your point about being reparented, I was like, oh, like the young version of me felt so incredibly soothed and
Oh,
affirmed.
that
I have
makes me
for
emotional.
sure.
That's so beautiful.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It was an important moment, and you're right that these relationships of ours, when we are able to work with them the way that you and John have and continue to do, I'm sure they become these arenas for healing in ways that we didn't even necessarily know. Yeah. I also heard, just like a big old underline and highlight of this idea of having a couple therapist, in the calendar every couple of weeks. And I love that you were there when things were good. And then that way, when things were hard, you already had that relationship built. So,
Well, I think what's interesting, and we still do this, right? And we're, I stepped back from Moms Demand Action a couple of years ago, and I've entered this whole new and different phase. But when we go to therapy, there are plenty of times that I think in the car, what in the hell are we going to talk about? And then it's so interesting because as you sit there and you have a discussion, things come to mind that maybe you pushed down or maybe you didn't think were important enough to explore. And it leads to this whole discussion that is really enlightening. And so this idea of only having to go when you know in your aware mind that there's something bothering you or harming the couple, the benefit of going no matter what is that you sometimes you don't realize that there are these things that you're thinking about or that are bothering you that aren't coming up.
oh yeah, it is such a good rule of thumb that the therapy session that you want to cancel because there's nothing going on, that's the therapy session you got to go to. So true. Okay, I want to tackle this next piece with you, and just it's something that I've been aware of, and I'm so curious if it's lands for you or kind of like where it resonates for you, which is that I am seeing and feeling with a lot of my cis hetero couples that what I know to be true is that in a thriving intimate relationship, there's just flow. There's flow between give and take. There's flow between asking and accommodating. And what I have been feeling the last number of years, probably since Trump's first term, I am finding the women in my practice who are married to men, it is increasingly difficult for that like flow and accommodation. I think it has to do with a lot of things. I think we're having new conversations about invisible labor and emotional labor. And I think there are important ways that women are like, oh my God, I've been bending my entire life enough already. But it feels to me also like it is that vigilance and that almost like rigidity around accommodation feels like it's also supercharged by what's happening at the like macro level of erosion of women's bodily autonomy and insane gun policy. It's like what happens at the macro is like sitting in our therapy room with us, and I think what I find is that husbands often feel bewildered, like that's not me, but I'm not doing that, but it's like, how do we, and it's part of what makes me so angry about this political moment is it's like, I feel so clearly that the political moment is sitting right here with me and this couple in this room, trying to kind of work on and heal this one particular marriage, I wonder just if any parts of that make sense for you, or if you have seen and heard and felt that with the people in your community.
Yeah, I'm very fortunate in that I am married to a feminist, and he has made dinner every night of our marriage. That we haven't gone out for the entirety of it, and does much more than his fair share. I have seen this among the Moms Demand Action volunteers that I work with, among my own friend community. I think what's so important to remember is also sometimes women settle for a marriage that isn't great. A lot of these issues are fixable, and there is certainly a gender divide, and I think we can learn a lot from that, and marriages, as we have talked about, can improve and get better. But I also think it's so important that women, when they think about coming alive and living their best life, no matter how old they are, that might include leaving a relationship that no longer serves you, right? If I had stayed in my first marriage, I would not have evolved in the way that I have. It was an important marriage. It lasted, 13 years and produced 3 children. And I love my ex-husband. He's a wonderful father, but I did not want to be married to him anymore. And women are so often taught to fulfill their obligations instead of following their desires. And if your desire is to be out of a relationship, it's important to listen to that and to give yourself permission to do that. And I think for some, this political moment has awakened in them. Maybe they're not in the right marriage.
It is why I want so badly for men to be in community with men, talking about their expansion and their like how to expand also and meet this moment and have communities with each other around how to do what John has done, how to like step in, how to meet her righteous anger, how to look at your own the ways in which there's a version of what's happening out there that is happening in here, like what the confronting that's happening for men, because women can't do what they're doing and also do that for men. It's not appropriate. It's not possible. It's such an important place for men to be. Is there where do the men who are wanting to be part of this movement, the gun violence prevention, where are they? Where are they gathering? What are they up to?
I mean, I will just be completely candid with you and say that we tried for years and years to organize men the way we organized women. And it was like herding cats. It was very difficult. Even my own husband isn't an activist, right? And what I think I've learned is that when you are in traditional positions of power, it's very hard to make people fearful enough or angry enough to take action. And that may just be, mostly straight white men, but it was difficult, if not impossible, to organize them over the years. What I have found in organizing is that when it is men and women, that is often men who want to set the strategy and take the spotlight, while women are expected to sort of make the snacks and reserve the spaces. And I think that's what's so profound about Moms Demand Action is that they do everything. Women do everything soup to nuts, right? And that is what makes them realize how they can come alive, that they have more skills than they imagined, they are more powerful than they imagined. I grapple with how to do this with men. I mean, I have a 24-year-old son, and I worry all the time, whether it's, being radicalized on YouTube or his friends or whatever that, or even buying into this whole, masculine energy idea that somehow it's a you're either or and not both. I'm not sure I understand the answers.
That piece about why it may be difficult for men to organize because they're not accustomed to not having that primary seat at the table makes so much sense. And so if nothing else, then it is basically how do you stay in service of her as she does this, right? If you're in a marriage with a woman or you have a sister, the women in your life, how do you serve them and nourish them as they do this work? I think that feels really key.
I agree with that. And I also think, women have their own journey and we all deserve to leave a legacy. And when you hear that word, people think often like, oh, my name on a medical building or, a huge endowment named after me. And it isn't that. It's simply about living the life that is true to you. And again, not just fulfilling your obligations, but following your desires. And we deserve to do that no matter how old we are. And I have seen this happen time and again through Moms Demand Action where volunteers come in and they think, oh, I know how to handle data, so I'm going to be the data entry lead. And then they end up managing people. And then they realize that they have all these abilities that are married to their values and their burning desires. And suddenly they want more from their lives. And that might mean their personal relationships. That might mean going back to school. It might mean a new job. It might mean starting their own organization. But it is this idea of I come alive when I do these things in community and I want more of that. And so I feel like my role is to encourage women to do that, no matter what the consequences are. Maybe the outcomes may be very scary because you do have to maybe face some stuff in your life that isn't working in the way that it should. And it either needs to be fixed or ended. I talk in my book about performing a controlled burn in your life. Like the whole book is a fire metaphor. And it's this idea of like, look at what serves you and what doesn't, and practice getting rid of the things that don't. That could be as simple as scrolling, or helicopter parenting, but it could be as profound as, am I in the right relationship? Am I in the right job? Am I doing what will make me feel like I have left a legacy? And I want my kids, when I was interviewing women for this book, the most common fear that they will have, at the end of their life, a deathbed regret, is that they sacrificed spending time with their children in order to pursue things that were important to them, that their children would resent the time they had spent away. Even state lawmakers, right? And what I know now, because I'm on the other side, I started Moms Demand Action when I had little kids. Now they're all adults. They don't say to me, Mom, I can't believe you didn't go to that soccer game in 2003. What they say is, I couldn't be more proud that you did something that was important to you and ended up being important to other people. And we can follow that example now. You gave us permission.
Okay. I remember being on a panel years ago with a woman who was, she had young adult. She's where we are now, when I was the mom of little ones. And I remember her saying on this panel, that very thing, my deep fear as I was growing up, as my kids were growing up, as an ambitious woman, is that my kids would resent the hell out of me for not being there more. And my kids don't ever say that. They just say, we're so proud of you. We're so proud that you do work in the world that you feel good about. And that is so, so, so important. When I've been following you on Instagram forever, and I got real brave one day. And I was like, come be on my show. Let's talk. And in my head, this was the conversation that I wanted to have with you. But it was before you had announced this book of yours. And so then when the book was announced, I was like, oh, well, that's very convenient that Shannon has already written the book that I am so excited to talk about. So and from where I stand in this new book, you are talking about everything that I would want you to be talking about, like bringing forth from your experience all these lessons that other people can learn from you. So tell us a little bit more about the book and your excitement about it and what you are hoping we're going to get from it.
Well, I have been working with women for decades and decades through my corporate work, through Moms Demand Action, as a board member at Merge America, and just in my everyday life, counseling and mentoring women. And I have been called the summoner of women's audacity, which, that is my legacy, I hope, because it makes me very proud. And so I was in this sacred pause that we were talking about at the beginning of the discussion, where I was stepping back from Moms Demand Action and trying to figure out what was next. And I got a call from Maria Shriver, who I don't know. I was running on a treadmill, and she called me and said, hey, I want you to write a book for my imprint, The Open Field, about everything you've learned. And I thought, I was going to take a year-long break. I wasn't going to do anything. And it was so important and right, and it was because I took that pause between Moms Demand Action and what was next to be able to figure that out. And I spent the next entire year writing this book and interviewing over 70 women. And it ended up being called Fired Up: How to Turn Your Spark into a Flame and Come Alive at Any Age. And it's this theme of fire, right? Like, how do you find your spark? How do you figure out what lights you up? And how do you, again, go after what you desire and not just what you feel obligated to do? And it's really for anyone who feels like they've been living on autopilot, right? If you are prioritizing others over your needs over your own, if you're, just wondering if it's too late to go after what you want, it's really a roadmap for uncovering how to give yourself permission to live fully and boldly and authentically. It provides the formula that I've learned for that. And at the end of the day, I want all women to be fire starters, right? And that's just a woman who rejects the societal expectations, who embraces her own unique desires unapologetically, who takes risks, who trusts your intuition, who recognizes, failure is just part of the journey. If you are living on fire, you are aligned, and it reshapes every relationship in your life, right? You're showing up as who you are, and that deepens, as we were saying, your connections with your partners and your children, your friends, and even with yourself.
On Maria Shriver's website, there is an excerpt, from the book about sacred pause, and in that you offer like very specific tools for how a woman can, kind of from the sacred pause, figure out what she wants to do next. And one of the things I loved was that you encourage women to talk to the women around them and say, to ask this vulnerable question, what do you see me as good at? What do you see as my gifts? I think it's so difficult sometimes to see our own gifts, to find our own niche, to understand where we might be in some kind of work. So I love the idea of asking that question to other people. What do you see in me?
I do think because of societal training and expectations, we see ourselves the way that we're told to be seen. And again, that's why becoming a volunteer or doing something different opens up so many different avenues, because you suddenly see yourself in a different light. And so some of that starts with asking other people how they see you, because maybe you're so in the weeds that you can't see that anymore. You can't see that you are an excellent communicator or persuader, or you can't see that you have this expertise that would change other people's lives, not just your own. And so I think reminding yourself of what you loved when you were young, asking other people how they see you, it puts back in perspective the parts that maybe you have lost sight of in yourself.
I love too, that ties to me really neatly to a point that you made a little while ago, which is that about sometimes it is in the process of starting to volunteer. I think I'm going to volunteer and do data entry. That then once you're in that context, it starts to grow and evolve and shift and change. So what I hear you saying really clearly is you don't have to have a three-dimensional thesis of what your next step is going to look like. You have to do enough to get yourself, in a space and then trust that it will evolve from there. It is the experience also that teaches you about yourself. You don't have to have a sum total of who you are to choose the experience. The experience works you as well. That's what I hear you saying.
Exactly. And also, that is one of the voices we have in our head, which is a fear of failure or a desire to be perfect, perfectionism. And yes, and so I think a lot of times women feel like they have to cross all the T's and dot all the I's in order to do anything, right? I have worked with so many brilliant women who have amazing ideas, but they never put them into motion because, oh, I have to read everything there is about it, or I have to get other people's sign off, or I need to know more or do more, or I'll get to it. If I had felt that way about Moms Demand Action, that I needed to know everything there was about gun violence, legislative process, organizing, I still wouldn't have started. And so what I want to give women permission to do is to fail, to know that you're going to try a lot of things and they're not all going to work, but eventually something will click.
Shannon, this has been incredible. You're incredible. I am so excited to share this conversation with Reimagining Love community because it's going to land so deeply. Will you, before I let you go, we will have in the show notes all of the links to order your brand new book, which is going to be fantastic. But I want to hear just other ways that folks can get to know you and connect with you more deeply.
Sure. You can find me on most social media platforms at Shannon R. Watts. And my Substack, where I write regular essays, is called Playing with Fire.
Wonderful. Thank you, Shannon.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Shannon, for empowering us to follow our purpose at any age. I loved our conversation for so many reasons, and I'm excited that you, Reimagining Love listener, likely feel mobilized and emboldened to explore that new area of interest in your life, whether it's activism or a new hobby you've been wanting to explore. You are never too old to expand and to grow and to bloom into your brightest self. If you would like to check out Shannon's book, Fired Up, How to Turn Your Spark into a Flame and Come Alive at Any Age, check out the show notes and you will find a link. Until next time, be well. Thank you for listening to our show. Our producers are Elizabeth Vogt and Mary Chan and Katie Pagich of Organized Sound Productions. Our theme music was composed by Slade Warnkin. The show is executive produced by me, Dr. Alexandra Solomon. Do you have a relationship question that you want answered on the show? Visit reimagininglove.com to send in a written or audio question. Questions can be about intimate partnerships, family relationships, friendships, you name it. If you're looking for more love and relationship content, you can find me on Instagram at dr.alexandra.solomon or visit my website, dralexandrasolomon.com, where you'll find my blog as well as the Intimate Relationships 101 e-course based off of the popular class I teach at Northwestern University. Thank you for listening and see you next week here on Reimagining Love.